38, Mother Bear, paid all medical bills for poor family's sick baby. How she got money shocked everyone. The morning mist clung to the window panes of the small wooden house like whispered secrets, and Ethan Marshall pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching his breath fog the surface. Outside, the ancient forest stretched endlessly, its towering pines swaying in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, almost knowing. Behind him, the soft whimper of his 6-month-old daughter Lily pierced the silence, and his heart clenched with a familiar ache. The sound had become the soundtrack of their lives, a constant reminder that time was slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. Jessica Brooks, his wife of 3 years, emerged from the nursery with dark circles under her eyes that told the story of countless sleepless nights. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched another medical bill. The paper seemed to mock them with its precise numbers, each digit representing another piece of hope they couldn't afford to lose. Ethan turned from the window and saw the defeat in her green eyes, the same defeat that had been growing stronger with each passing day since Lily's diagnosis. "The specialist wants to see her again next week," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle creaking of the old house. "The medication isn't working the way they hoped it would." She sank into their worn armchair, the one they'd bought second-hand when they first moved to this remote corner of the world, seeking peace and simplicity. Now, that same isolation felt like a prison, trapping them with their fears and their empty bank account. Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his. The calluses on his palms told the story of his work at the local lumber mill, honest work that barely kept them afloat even before Lily's illness had turned their world upside down. "We'll figure it out," he said, though the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. "We always do." But deep down, he wondered if their luck had finally run out. If love and determination were enough when faced with the cold reality of medical bills that seemed to multiply overnight. The house fell silent except for the distant sound of wind through the trees, and that's when they both noticed it. The presence. It wasn't the first time they'd felt watched, but today the sensation was stronger, more deliberate. Ethan rose slowly and moved back to the window, his eyes scanning the tree line. There, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, stood a large brown bear. She was magnificent, her coat thick and glossy in the morning light. But what struck him most was her posture. She wasn't foraging or wandering aimlessly like the other bears they occasionally spotted. She was standing perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed directly on their house, specifically on the window of Lily's nursery. "Jessica," Ethan called softly, not wanting to startle the animal or wake their sleeping daughter. "Come look at this." His wife joined him at the window, and together they watched the bear with a mixture of fear and fascination. The creature seemed almost human in her stillness, in the way she held her massive head tilted slightly to one side, as if she were listening to something they couldn't hear. For several long minutes the bear remained motionless, and Ethan found himself holding his breath, as if any movement might break whatever spell had been cast over this moment. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the bear turned and disappeared into the dense undergrowth, leaving only the swaying branches to mark her passage. Jessica pressed closer to Ethan, her body trembling slightly. "How long do you think she was standing there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, unable to answer. Something about the encounter felt significant, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly had changed. The air in the house seemed different somehow, charged with possibility or perhaps just his imagination running wild from stress and exhaustion. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythm of feeding schedules, medication times, and worried glances at their dwindling bank balance. But as evening approached, bringing with it the golden light that filtered through their kitchen windows, Ethan found himself thinking about the bear again. He'd grown up in these woods, had seen plenty of wildlife over the years, but never had he encountered an animal that seemed so deliberately aware, so purposeful in its observation. He shared his thoughts with Jessica over their simple dinner of canned soup and day-old bread, and she admitted that she too couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened. That night, as they lay in their creaky old bed, listening to Lily's labored breathing through the baby monitor, Ethan stared at the ceiling and wondered if desperation was making him see meaning where none existed. The medical bills were piling up faster than his modest paycheck could handle, and the specialist had been clear about the urgency of Lily's condition. Without proper treatment, their beautiful daughter might not see her first birthday. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air seeping through their poorly insulated windows. The next morning brought an impossible discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Ethan stepped onto their small front porch to retrieve the newspaper, a luxury they'd been considering canceling to save money, when he noticed something unusual. There, placed carefully beside their old wooden rocking chair, was a small bundle wrapped in what looked like leaves and tied with grass. His first instinct was caution. Memories of childhood warnings about strange packages and unknown dangers. But curiosity won out over fear. Inside the natural wrapping, Ethan found exactly $237 in crisp $20 bills, along with some smaller denominations. The amount was oddly specific, and it took him a moment to realize why it felt familiar. He rushed back inside, fumbling through the stack of medical bills on their kitchen table until he found what he was looking for. The prescription for Lily's new medication, the one they'd been unable to afford, cost exactly $237. The coincidence sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. "Jessica," he called, his voice cracking with emotion. "You need to see this." She appeared in the doorway, still in her faded nightgown, her hair tousled from sleep. When he showed her the money and explained about the prescription, her face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, hope, fear, and finally, a kind of desperate gratitude that broke his heart. They stood together in their small kitchen, holding the mysterious gift, afraid to believe it was real and equally afraid to question its source. The drive to the pharmacy felt surreal, like they were living in someone else's life. Ethan kept glancing at the money in Jessica's lap, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage. But it remained solid and real, and when the pharmacist handed them Lily's medication, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. On the drive home, they speculated about who might have left the money, running through a list of neighbors and friends, but none of it made sense. They were relatively new to the area, and while people were friendly enough, no one knew them well enough to understand their exact financial needs. That evening, as they gave Lily her first dose of the new medication, Ethan found himself looking out the window toward the forest with new eyes. The bear was there again, standing in almost the exact same spot as the day before, her gaze fixed on their house with that same uncanny intensity. This time, instead of fear, he felt something closer to gratitude, though he couldn't explain why. The rational part of his mind insisted that the appearance of the money and the presence of the bear were unrelated coincidences, but his heart whispered a different story. Over the following weeks, a pattern began to emerge that defied all logical explanation. Each time a new medical bill arrived, each time they faced another financial crisis related to Lily's care, money would appear on their porch in the exact amount needed. Never more, never less, always wrapped in natural materials and placed with care beside their rocking chair. And always, without fail, the bear would be visible at the edge of the forest, watching their house with her patient, knowing gaze. The first few times, Ethan had rushed outside to look for clues, to find some trace of their mysterious benefactor. But the forest revealed nothing, except the usual signs of wildlife: deer tracks, scattered pine cones, the occasional bird feather. No human footprints, no tire tracks, no evidence of anyone approaching their isolated home under cover of darkness. It was as if the money simply materialized out of thin air, guided by some force beyond their understanding. Jessica began to change during this time, and Ethan watched with growing amazement as hope slowly replaced the despair that had been consuming her. Lily's condition was improving with the new medications, her breathing easier, her color better, her tiny smiles becoming more frequent. But more than that, Jessica seemed to be rediscovering her faith in the possibility of miracles, in the idea that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected sources. She started talking about guardian angels and divine intervention, concepts that would have made Ethan uncomfortable in the past, but now seemed as reasonable as any other explanation. The townspeople began to notice changes too. Dr. Sarah Chen, Lily's pediatrician, commented on how remarkable it was that they'd been able to afford all the recommended treatments. The pharmacist, Mrs. Rodriguez, mentioned how unusual it was to see a family in their situation able to pay cash for expensive medications without any apparent financial strain. Word began to spread through their small mountain community about the young family whose luck had mysteriously changed, and with it came a growing sense of wonder and speculation. Ethan found himself becoming something of a local celebrity, though he was careful never to reveal the true source of their good fortune. When neighbors asked how they were managing Lily's medical expenses, he would simply say they'd been blessed with unexpected help, leaving the details deliberately vague. But privately, he began to document everything: the dates money appeared, the exact amounts, the corresponding bills, and most importantly, his sightings of the bear. A pattern was definitely emerging, one that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The bear's behavior was unlike anything he'd ever heard of or read about. She appeared to follow a schedule, showing up consistently in the early morning hours and again at dusk, always in the same general area, always with that same focused attention on their house. She never approached closer than the tree line, never showed any signs of aggression or typical wild animal behavior. Instead, she seemed almost contemplative, as if she were keeping vigil over their family, watching and waiting for something only she understood. One particularly difficult evening, when Lily had been fussier than usual, and the stress was wearing on both parents, Ethan decided to step outside for some fresh air. The bear was there, as he'd somehow known she would be, but this time something was different. As he stood on his porch looking across the clearing that separated his house from the forest, the bear took several steps forward, moving closer than she'd ever come before. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they looked at each other across the distance, and Ethan felt a connection he couldn't begin to explain. In that moment, he understood with absolute certainty that the bear was somehow connected to their miraculous change in fortune. The rational part of his mind rebelled against such a fantastical notion, but his heart accepted it as truth. This magnificent creature, for reasons beyond his comprehension, had become their protector, their provider, their guardian angel in the most unexpected form imaginable. The realization filled him with such overwhelming gratitude that tears began to flow down his cheeks, and he found himself whispering "thank you" into the evening air. The bear seemed to hear him, or perhaps she simply understood the emotion in his posture, because she stood up on her hind legs for just a moment. a gesture that felt almost like acknowledgement before dropping back down and disappearing into the forest. Ethan remained on the porch long after she was gone, staring at the spot where she'd stood, trying to process what had just happened. When he finally went back inside, Jessica took one look at his face and knew that something significant had occurred. As autumn deepened into winter, their strange situation continued unchanged. Money appeared whenever needed. The bear maintained her vigilant watch, and Lily continued to improve. The little girl was now sitting up on her own, babbling happily, and showing all the signs of a healthy, thriving baby. The doctors were amazed by her progress, calling it remarkable and using words like miraculous recovery that made Ethan and Jessica exchange knowing glances. They had witnessed their own miracle. Even if they couldn't fully explain it to anyone else, the community around them began to embrace the mystery rather than solve it. Stories spread about the family in the woods whose guardian bear had brought them luck and healing. Some people drove up the winding mountain road just to catch a glimpse of the legendary creature, though she seemed to appear only for Ethan and Jessica. Children in town began drawing pictures of bears and babies, and the local church started including prayers for all the guardian angels, in whatever form they may take, in their weekly services. But for Ethan, the most profound change was in his understanding of connection and purpose. He began to see their story not as a series of random events, but as part of something larger and more meaningful. If their experience could inspire others to believe in the possibility of unexpected help, in the idea that we're all connected in ways we can't always see, then perhaps their struggle had served a greater purpose. He started thinking about sharing their story with the world, about reaching out to other families facing similar challenges, about being a voice of hope in a world that often felt hopeless. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Lily was sleeping peacefully, Ethan would sit by the window and watch for their guardian. The bear was almost always there, a dark silhouette against the snow-covered trees, maintaining her patient vigil. In these quiet moments he felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude that went beyond their immediate circumstances. Their family had been chosen for something special, something that defied explanation but filled their lives with meaning and wonder. Jessica, too, had been transformed by their experience. The woman who had once been consumed by worry and despair now moved through their daily routines with a calm confidence that amazed everyone who knew her. She spoke often about the lessons they were learning about trust, about faith, about the interconnectedness of all living things. Her relationship with Lily had deepened as well, as if the miracle of their daughter's healing had opened new channels of love and understanding between them. The winter months brought new challenges, as they always did in their remote mountain home. The roads became treacherous, making trips to the doctor more difficult and dangerous. But somehow, their mysterious benefactor seemed to understand even these complications. On the morning before a particularly severe storm was predicted to hit, Ethan found not just money on his porch, but also a small bundle of herbs that he later learned were traditional remedies for respiratory ailments. When he showed them to Dr. Chen, she was amazed by their quality and appropriateness for Lily's condition. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the first green shoots of new growth, Ethan reflected on how much their lives had changed. A year ago, they had been a struggling young family facing an impossible situation with no resources and little hope. Now, while their circumstances hadn't dramatically improved in conventional terms, they felt rich in ways that money couldn't measure. They had witnessed something extraordinary, been part of a story that challenged the boundaries between the possible and impossible, and emerged with a faith in the fundamental goodness of the universe that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. The bear continued her vigil, though Ethan noticed subtle changes in her behavior as the seasons shifted. She seemed more relaxed now, less urgently focused on their house, and more naturally integrated into the forest ecosystem around them. Sometimes he would see her foraging for berries, or teaching what appeared to be cubs the skills they would need to survive. But she never failed to acknowledge their presence when he appeared on the porch, and he never failed to feel that surge of gratitude and wonder that had become such an integral part of his daily experience. One evening in late spring, as the sun was setting behind the mountains and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan made a decision that had been building in his heart for months. He would find a way to share their story with the world, not for fame or recognition, but because he believed that others needed to hear about the miracles that were possible when we opened our hearts to the unexpected. If even one family facing similar struggles could find hope in their experience, if even one person could be inspired to look for guardian angels in unlikely forms, then their journey would have served its greater purpose. As he stood on his porch that evening, watching the bear settle into her usual spot at the forest's edge, Ethan felt a deep sense of completion and anticipation. Their story was far from over, but this chapter, the chapter of desperate need met by inexplicable abundance, was drawing to a close. Lily was healthy and thriving. Their family was stronger than ever, and they had been given a gift of faith and wonder that would last a lifetime. Whatever came next, they would face it with the knowledge that miracles were real, that help could come from the most unexpected sources, and that love truly did have the power to transform the impossible into the inevitable. The second chapter of their extraordinary journey began on a crisp morning in early summer, when Lily took her first tentative steps across their small living room. Ethan and Jessica watched in amazement as their daughter, now over a year old and glowing with health, toddled from the couch to the window, where she pressed her tiny hands against the glass and babbled excitedly. Following her gaze, they saw their familiar guardian standing at the edge of the forest, and for the first time, the bear seemed to be looking directly at Lily rather than simply watching over the house in general. The moment felt significant in a way that Ethan couldn't quite articulate, as if some invisible milestone had been reached or some unspoken agreement had been fulfilled. The bear remained in her usual spot for several more minutes, but there was something different about her posture, something that suggested satisfaction or perhaps even pride. When she finally turned and disappeared into the trees, Ethan had the strangest feeling that she was pleased with what she had witnessed, that Lily's first steps represented more than just a normal developmental milestone. Over the following weeks, their mysterious financial support continued, but the amounts began to change in subtle ways. Instead of exact matches for specific medical bills, they started finding slightly larger sums, as if their benefactor understood that Lily's needs were evolving from crisis management to ongoing wellness and development. The money now covered not just medications and doctor visits, but also nutritious foods, educational toys, and even a small college fund that Jessica had started with tears of joy streaming down her face. The community's fascination with their story had grown as well, and Ethan found himself fielding more and more questions from neighbors, reporters, and even researchers who had heard about the family with the guardian bear. He was careful to protect their privacy while still sharing enough details to inspire others, and he was amazed by the response. Letters began arriving from families around the world who were facing their own impossible situations, and many of them reported their own encounters with unexpected help that defied rational explanation. Dr. Chen, who had been treating Lily since her birth, began documenting their case for a medical journal, focusing not just on the remarkable recovery, but on the role that hope and community support had played in the healing process. She was fascinated by the psychological aspects of their experience, the way that faith in their mysterious guardian had seemed to accelerate Lily's improvement beyond what medical science could fully explain. Her research would later contribute to a growing body of work on the connection between emotional well-being and physical healing. But for Ethan, the most profound changes were happening on a personal level. His relationship with the natural world around their home had deepened in ways he never could have imagined. He found himself spending hours observing the forest, learning to read the subtle signs and signals that had always been there, but which he had never noticed before. He began to understand that the bear was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a complex ecosystem of awareness and connection that extended far beyond what most people ever recognized. The bear herself seemed to be evolving as well. Her appearances became less frequent but more meaningful, often coinciding with significant moments in Lily's development, or important decisions that Ethan and Jessica needed to make. She had developed a repertoire of subtle signals: the angle of her head, the duration of her gaze, her position relative to different trees, that Ethan was beginning to interpret as a form of communication. It was as if she was gradually teaching him to see the world through her eyes, to understand the deeper currents of connection and purpose that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. One particularly memorable encounter occurred on a foggy morning in late summer, when Ethan stepped outside to find the bear much closer than usual, standing at the very edge of their property line. She was holding something in her mouth, and as he watched with growing amazement, she carefully placed it on the ground and stepped back. When the fog cleared enough for him to see clearly, he discovered a beautiful piece of driftwood, polished smooth by years of water and weather, carved with intricate natural patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their beauty. Jessica was as mystified as he was by this gift, but they both agreed that it felt significant. They placed the driftwood on their mantelpiece, where it became a focal point for meditation and reflection. Visitors to their home were invariably drawn to it, commenting on its unusual beauty and the sense of peace it seemed to emanate. Some people claimed they could see faces or symbols in its natural grain, while others simply found themselves feeling calmer and more centered when they looked at it. As autumn returned and the forest began its spectacular display of color, Ethan noticed that the bear's behavior was changing again. She seemed more restless, more purposeful in her movements, as if she were preparing for something important. Her visits became more frequent but shorter, and she began leading him on brief walks along the forest paths, always returning him safely to his house but showing him new areas of the woods that he had never explored before. During one of these walks, she led him to a small clearing where an old cabin stood hidden among the trees. The structure was clearly abandoned, its windows dark and its roof partially collapsed, but something about it felt familiar in a way that Ethan couldn't explain. The bear approached the cabin with obvious familiarity, sniffing around its foundation and even standing up on her hind legs to peer through one of the broken windows. Then she turned to look at Ethan with an expression that seemed almost expectant, as if she were waiting for him to understand something important. But the meaning of the cabin remained elusive, and after several minutes the bear led him back home along a different path that revealed even more of the forest's hidden beauty. That night, Ethan told Jessica about the discovery, and they speculated about who might have lived in the cabin and what connection it might have to their mysterious guardian. The questions added another layer to their already complex story, but rather than feeling frustrated by the lack of answers, they found themselves enjoying the deepening mystery. The winter months brought unexpected challenges that tested their faith in ways they hadn't anticipated. Lily developed a minor respiratory infection that, while not serious, required expensive treatments that their usual mysterious support didn't seem to cover. For the first time in over a year, they found themselves facing medical bills without the corresponding appearance of money on their porch. The situation forced them to confront the possibility that their guardian's help might not be unlimited or permanent. Ethan spent long hours watching the forest, looking for signs of the bear, but her appearances became increasingly rare. When she did show up, she seemed distracted, less focused on their house and more concerned with something deeper in the woods. Jessica worried that they had somehow disappointed their benefactor, or that the magic that had sustained them was finally coming to an end. The fear that had been absent from their lives for so long began to creep back in, bringing with it all the old anxieties about their ability to provide for their daughter's needs. But just when their faith was beginning to waver, something extraordinary happened that would change their understanding of their situation forever. Ethan woke one morning to find not money on his porch, but a small, hand-drawn map wrapped in the same natural materials that had always accompanied their mysterious gifts. The map appeared to show the forest around their home, with a clear path marked from their house to what looked like the old cabin the bear had shown him months earlier. At the bottom of the map, written in shaky handwriting, were the words "For Lily's future." The discovery sent chills down Ethan's spine and filled him with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The map suggested that their guardian was not just an animal acting on instinct, but someone or something with the ability to plan, to communicate through symbols, and to think about long-term consequences. The implications were staggering, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about their situation. Who or what was their guardian? How long had they been watching over his family? And what did they want him to find at the old cabin? Jessica was equally amazed by the map, but she also felt a growing sense of urgency. Lily's medical bills were mounting again, and they were running out of savings to cover the expenses. If their guardian wanted them to follow the map, perhaps it was because the solution to their current crisis lay at its destination. After much discussion and careful planning, they decided that Ethan would follow the map's directions, while Jessica stayed home with Lily, ready to call for help if anything went wrong. The journey to the cabin took longer than expected, partly because Ethan was being extra cautious and partly because he kept stopping to look for signs of the bear. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if all the wildlife were holding their breath in anticipation of something significant. When he finally reached the clearing where the old cabin stood, he was surprised to find that it looked different than he remembered. The door, which had been hanging askew on broken hinges during his previous visit, was now standing wide open, as if someone had recently passed through. Ethan approached the cabin with growing excitement and trepidation. The structure was even more dilapidated up close, with gaps in the walls and holes in the roof that let in shafts of golden sunlight. But despite its obvious abandonment, there were signs that someone had been there recently. The floor had been swept clean of debris, and a small table near the window held what appeared to be a collection of carefully arranged objects. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, Ethan began to make out the details of what had been left for him to find. The table held a stack of old journals, their leather covers worn smooth by years of handling. Beside them was a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols that reminded him of the patterns in the driftwood the bear had given them. And next to the box, arranged with obvious care, was exactly the amount of money they needed to cover Lily's current medical expenses, along with a substantial additional sum that would ensure her care for months to come. But it was the journals that captured Ethan's attention most completely. As he carefully opened the first volume, he discovered page after page of detailed observations about the forest and its inhabitants, written in the same shaky handwriting that had appeared on the map. The author had clearly been someone who understood the natural world with extraordinary depth and sensitivity, recording not just scientific observations but philosophical reflections on the interconnectedness of all living things. As Ethan read deeper into the journals, a picture began to emerge of their mysterious benefactor that was both more and less extraordinary than anything he had imagined. The writer was clearly human, not some supernatural being, but their understanding of the forest and its creatures was so profound that they seemed to exist in a different realm of awareness altogether. They wrote about the bear with obvious affection and respect, describing her as a friend and partner in their long vigil over the surrounding area. The final entries in the most recent journal were dated just a few months earlier, and they spoke directly to Ethan's family situation. The writer had been aware of their struggles from the beginning, had watched their love and dedication to Lily, and had made the decision to help in the only way they could. But more than that, they had recognized in Ethan and Jessica the kind of people who would understand and appreciate the deeper mysteries of life, who would be worthy guardians of the secrets they were about to inherit. As Ethan closed the final journal and prepared to return home with his incredible discoveries, he noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. The bear emerged from the trees, but she was not alone. Behind her walked an elderly man, bent with age but moving with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. His hair was white as snow, his clothes were simple and well-worn, and his eyes held the same deep intelligence that Ethan had always sensed in the bear's gaze. The old man approached slowly, his hands visible and his manner unthreatening, but Ethan felt no fear. Something about the stranger's presence felt familiar, as if they had been connected long before this moment of actual meeting. When the man spoke, his voice was soft and warm, with the cadence of someone who had spent years talking primarily to animals and trees. "I've been waiting for the right time to meet you," the old man said, settling himself carefully on a fallen log near the cabin's entrance. "My name is Thomas, and I've been watching over your family since you first moved to these woods. The bear and we've been partners in this work for many years now, and we both agreed that you and your wife were special people deserving of whatever help we could provide." Ethan's hands trembled as he held Thomas's weathered journals, the weight of their contents far heavier than the paper and ink they contained. The old man sat patiently on his fallen log, the bear resting peacefully at his side like a faithful dog, while Ethan processed the magnitude of what he had discovered. Thomas wasn't just a hermit living in the woods, he was something far more extraordinary. A guardian angel in human form who had chosen to dedicate his life to watching over others with a devotion that transcended normal human understanding. "I know you have questions," Thomas said gently, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in contemplation and observation. "The bear and we've been waiting for this moment for a long time. We knew that eventually you would need to understand the full truth of what's been happening, not just for your own peace of mind, but because there's something important we need to ask of you." The old man's eyes, pale blue and filled with wisdom, seemed to look right through Ethan to some deeper truth that lay beneath the surface of their extraordinary situation. Ethan found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "How long have you been living out here? How long have you been watching over families like mine?" The questions tumbled out of him, each one leading to 3 more, as if a dam had burst in his mind. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face and revealing the gentle soul that had been hidden behind years of solitude and responsibility. "I came to these woods 43 years ago," Thomas began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller who had rehearsed this tale many times in his own mind. "I was running from a life that had become too complicated, too full of noise and meaningless obligations. I thought I was looking for peace and solitude, but what I found was purpose. The bear's mother found me during my first winter here, when I was sick and probably dying from pneumonia. She brought me food, led me to shelter, nursed me back to health in ways that science would say are impossible, but which I experienced firsthand." The bear beside Thomas shifted slightly, as if she understood that her family's story was being told. Thomas reached out and gently scratched behind her ears, the gesture so natural and familiar that it spoke of decades of companionship and mutual understanding. When her mother passed away, this beautiful girl here took over the responsibility. But by then, I had begun to understand that we weren't just living in these woods. We were guardians of something larger. The forest has a way of showing you where help is needed, if you know how to listen and watch. Ethan sank down onto a nearby stump, his legs suddenly too weak to support him, as the implications of Thomas's words began to sink in. You're saying that you've been helping families for 40 years. That you and the bear have been some kind of supernatural rescue team. The words sounded ridiculous even as he spoke them, but Thomas's calm acceptance of their situation made even the most fantastical explanations seem reasonable. Not supernatural, Thomas corrected gently. Just natural in a way that most people have forgotten how to see. The forest is alive, Ethan, in ways that go far beyond what science teaches us. It has consciousness, it has intention, and it has the ability to guide those who are willing to listen. The bear and we've learned to be instruments of that consciousness. When a family like yours appears, struggling with love and dedication, but lacking resources, the forest shows us how to help. The old man stood up slowly, his movements careful but determined, and walked toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said. "There's more you need to see, more you need to understand about what we're asking of you." Ethan followed, his mind reeling with questions and possibilities. The interior of the cabin, which had seemed empty and abandoned during his previous visits, now revealed itself to be carefully organized and purposefully arranged. Along one wall, Thomas had created what could only be described as a shrine to the families he had helped over the decades. Photographs, newspaper clippings, children's drawings, and letters of gratitude covered every available surface. Each item told a story of crisis averted, of hope restored, of lives saved by mysterious intervention that the recipients had never been able to fully explain. Ethan recognized some of the families from stories he had heard in town, legends of miraculous recoveries, and unexpected windfalls that had become part of local folklore. 47 families, Thomas said quietly, running his finger along the edge of one particularly faded photograph. 47 times that the forest has shown us where help was needed, and 47 times we've been able to make a difference. Your family is number 48, but you're also something special. You're the first family that has been chosen not just to receive help, but to understand the truth of what's been happening. Ethan studied the wall of memories, each item representing a life changed, a crisis overcome, a family saved from despair. The scope of what Thomas and the bear had accomplished was staggering, but what struck him most was the obvious love and care that had gone into preserving these mementos. This wasn't the work of someone seeking recognition or gratitude, but of someone who found deep satisfaction in the simple act of helping others. "Why us?" Ethan asked. "Why are we the ones being told the truth?" Thomas turned from the wall of photographs and looked at him with an expression that combined sadness and hope in equal measure. "Because I'm dying, Ethan. The cancer started about 6 months ago, and the doctors in town have given me maybe another year if I'm lucky. The bear and we need someone to carry on this work. Someone who understands the deeper connections that make it possible." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. The idea that this gentle, wise man who had devoted his life to helping others was facing his own mortality seemed impossibly cruel. But even as his heart broke for Thomas, his mind began to understand the true reason he had been brought to this cabin, the real purpose behind all the mysterious events of the past year and a half. "You want me to take over," Ethan said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. The forest has been preparing you, teaching you to see and understand things that most people miss. The bear has been evaluating you, determining whether you have the patience, the wisdom, and the dedication necessary for this work. We believe you do, but the choice has to be yours. Ethan looked around the cabin, trying to imagine himself living in this remote place, dedicating his life to watching over strangers and providing help in moments of crisis. The idea was both terrifying and deeply appealing. He thought about his own family's experience, about the profound sense of connection and purpose he had felt during their year of mysterious support. Could he provide that same sense of hope and wonder to other families facing impossible situations? "What about Jessica and Lily?" he asked. "I can't abandon my family to become some kind of forest hermit." Thomas smiled, the expression warm and understanding. "Who said anything about abandoning them? This work doesn't require you to give up your family, Ethan. It requires you to expand your definition of what family means. Jessica and Lily would be welcome here, would be part of this larger purpose. The cabin can be rebuilt, made comfortable for a growing family. The forest provides for those who serve it." The bear, who had been lying quietly near the cabin's entrance, suddenly stood and walked over to Ethan. She pressed her massive head against his leg in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate, and Ethan felt a surge of connection and understanding that went beyond words. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that this magnificent creature had been evaluating him all along, determining whether he was worthy of the trust and responsibility that Thomas was offering. "She approves of you," Thomas said softly. "She's been watching you for over a year, studying how you treat your family, how you respond to stress, how you handle the mystery and uncertainty of your situation. Bears are excellent judges of character, and she's convinced that you have what it takes to continue this work." Ethan reached out tentatively and stroked the bear's thick fur, amazed by her gentleness and the obvious intelligence in her dark eyes. Over the next several hours, Thomas shared the details of how their guardian system worked. The forest, he explained, had a way of revealing families in crisis to those who knew how to look. Sometimes it was as simple as overhearing conversations in town, but often it involved more subtle signs, changes in the behavior of local wildlife, unusual weather patterns, or simply a feeling of being drawn to investigate a particular area. The bear was particularly gifted at sensing emotional distress, and she had an uncanny ability to lead Thomas to families who needed help. The money, Thomas revealed, came from a variety of sources that he had developed over the decades. He was an accomplished artist, specializing in wood carvings and paintings of forest scenes that he sold through galleries in distant cities. He also had a small inheritance from his previous life that he had never touched, preferring to live simply and save the money for families in need. Most importantly, he had developed relationships with several wealthy individuals who had been helped by his interventions over the years, and who now contributed regularly to his unofficial charity work. The key, Thomas explained, is to never take credit, never seek recognition, and never let the families you help know the full extent of what you're doing. The mystery is part of what makes it work. People need to believe in magic, in the possibility that help can come from unexpected sources. If they knew it was just an old man and a bear living in the woods, it would lose some of its power to inspire and transform. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin's broken windows, Ethan knew that his life had reached a turning point. The decision facing him was enormous, with implications that would affect not just his own future, but the lives of countless families he had never met. He thought about Jessica and Lily, about the life they had built together, about the dreams and plans they had made. Could he ask them to give up their normal existence to become part of something so extraordinary and demanding? But even as he wrestled with the practical implications of Thomas's offer, Ethan felt a deep sense of rightness about the possibility. Their own experience had shown him the transformative power of mysterious help, the way that unexpected support could not only solve immediate problems, but also restore faith and hope in ways that lasted long after the crisis had passed. The idea of being able to provide that same gift to other families filled him with a sense of purpose and meaning that he had never experienced before. "I need to talk to Jessica," Ethan said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make alone." Thomas nodded, his expression understanding and patient. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The bear and I will continue to watch over your family while you decide. But don't take too long, Ethan. There are already 3 families in the area who need help, and my energy isn't what it used to be." The walk home felt like a journey between 2 different worlds. Behind him lay the cabin and the extraordinary revelation of Thomas's life work. Ahead lay his normal existence as a husband and father, trying to make ends meet in a complicated world. But Ethan knew that there was no going back to the way things had been before. Whether he accepted Thomas's offer or not, he would never again see their situation as simply a series of fortunate coincidences. He had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of ordinary reality, and that knowledge would change him forever. Jessica was waiting on the porch when he arrived home, Lily sleeping peacefully in her arms. One look at his face told her that something momentous had happened, and she listened with growing amazement as he shared the story of his encounter with Thomas and the bear. When he finished, they sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky and trying to process the magnitude of what they had learned. "So, we've been part of some kind of guardian angel network this whole time," Jessica said finally, her voice filled with wonder rather than disbelief. "And now, we're being asked to become the guardian angels for other families." Ethan nodded, studying her face for any sign of how she was processing this incredible information. To his amazement, she seemed more excited than frightened by the possibilities. "I keep thinking about how we felt during those worst moments," Jessica continued. "The desperation, the fear that we were going to lose Lily, the sense that there was no help coming from anywhere. And then the miracle started happening. And it wasn't just the money, Ethan, it was the hope. It was the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone or something was watching over us and caring about what happened to our family." She shifted Lily to her other arm and looked directly at him. "If we can give that feeling to other families, if we can be the source of miracles for people who are facing what we faced, then how can we say no? This feels like what we're supposed to do, like what we've been preparing for without even knowing it." Her words echoed his own thoughts so perfectly that Ethan felt a surge of love and gratitude that brought tears to his eyes. They spent the rest of the evening discussing the practical aspects of Thomas's offer. The cabin would need to be extensively renovated to accommodate their family, but Thomas had assured Ethan that the resources for such improvements would be available. Jessica's nursing background would be invaluable for helping families dealing with medical crises, and Ethan's growing understanding of the forest and its rhythms would serve him well in the role of guardian and protector. Most importantly, they both felt a deep sense of rightness about the possibility of raising Lily in an environment where helping others was the primary focus of daily life. Their daughter would grow up understanding that she was part of something larger than herself, that her own miraculous recovery had been just the beginning of a story that would touch countless other lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Ethan returned to the cabin with Jessica and Lily, eager to introduce his family to Thomas and to begin the process of transition. But when they arrived at the clearing, they found only the bear waiting for them. her posture somehow conveying both sadness and urgency. She led them immediately to the cabin, where they discovered Thomas lying peacefully on his simple bed, his eyes closed and his hands folded across his chest. He had passed away during the night, but his face wore an expression of such profound peace and satisfaction that it was clear he had died knowing that his life's work would continue. On the table beside his bed, he had left a letter addressed to Ethan and Jessica, along with detailed instructions for carrying on the guardian work and a substantial sum of money to begin their new life. The letter was brief but deeply moving, expressing Thomas's gratitude for their willingness to accept the responsibility he was passing on to them. He wrote about his confidence in their abilities, his excitement about the new energy and perspective they would bring to the work, and his certainty that the bear would be an excellent teacher and partner for them in the years ahead. Most touchingly, he expressed his joy at knowing that Lily would grow up as part of the guardian tradition, potentially carrying the work forward into future generations. The funeral was small and private, attended only by Ethan, Jessica, Lily, and the bear, who seemed to understand exactly what was happening and grieved in her own profound way. They buried Thomas in a peaceful spot overlooking the forest he had loved and protected for so many decades, marking the grave with a simple stone carved with the words, "Guardian of the Forest, friend to all who needed help." In the weeks that followed, as they began the process of renovating the cabin and transitioning into their new role, Ethan and Jessica discovered that Thomas had been far more organized and systematic than they had initially realized. He had kept detailed files on every family he had helped, including follow-up information about their long-term outcomes and ongoing needs. He had established relationships with contractors, suppliers, and service providers who could be trusted to work discreetly and efficiently. Most importantly, he had created a network of supporters and contributors who were eager to continue funding the guardian work under new leadership. The bear, whose name they learned was Luna, proved to be an invaluable teacher and guide. She seemed to understand that her role had evolved from Thomas's partner to their mentor, and she took her new responsibilities seriously. She taught them to read the subtle signs that indicated families in crisis, showed them the hidden paths through the forest that allowed for discreet observation and intervention, and gradually introduced them to the complex ecosystem of awareness and connection that made their work possible. Their first independent intervention came just 2 months after Thomas's death, when Luna led them to a young single mother whose child was facing a serious but treatable medical condition. Following Thomas's methods, they provided the exact amount of money needed for treatment, delivered in the same mysterious manner that had sustained their own family. The woman's tears of gratitude and relief, witnessed from a discreet distance, confirmed for both Ethan and Jessica that they had found their true calling. As autumn approached and they settled more fully into their new life, Ethan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. 1.5 years earlier, they had been a desperate family facing an impossible situation with no resources and little hope. Now, they were the guardians of hope for other families, the invisible hands that provided help when it was needed most, the living proof that miracles were real, and that love truly did have the power to transform the world. The final chapter of their transformation began on a crisp morning in late fall, when Ethan discovered something extraordinary hidden in the deepest part of Thomas's cabin. While organizing the old man's belongings, he found a secret compartment built into the floor beneath Thomas's bed. Inside was a collection of items that took his breath away and changed his understanding of their guardian work in ways he never could have imagined. The compartment contained dozens of journals, far more than Thomas had shown him during their first meeting. But these weren't just records of the families he had helped over the decades. They were detailed accounts of a guardian tradition that stretched back generations, passed down through a lineage of forest protectors who had been watching over the surrounding communities for more than 200 years. Thomas hadn't been the originator of their work. He had been the latest in a long line of guardians, each chosen and trained by their predecessor, each dedicated to the same mission of providing help to those who needed it most. The journals revealed that the guardian tradition had begun in the early 1800s, when a Native American medicine man named Standing Bear had established the first watch over these woods. According to the records, Standing Bear had been visited in a vision by the spirit of the forest itself, which had charged him with the responsibility of protecting not just the trees and animals but also the human families who lived in harmony with the natural world. When Standing Bear grew old, he had passed the responsibility to a white settler named Jonathan Whitmore, who had proven himself worthy through years of respectful interaction with the forest and its inhabitants. Each guardian had adapted the work to the needs and circumstances of their time, but the core mission had remained constant. They were to watch, to listen, to understand when help was needed, and to provide that help in ways that preserved the mystery and wonder of the intervention. The Bear families had been part of the tradition from the beginning, with each generation of guardians forming a partnership with a bear family that lasted for decades. But it was the final journal, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, that contained the most shocking revelation of all. Thomas had known about Ethan's family long before they had moved to the woods. The forest had been sending him signs and dreams about their coming for more than a year, preparing him for the arrival of the family who would become his successors. Their decision to move to this remote area, their choice of the specific house that bordered the forest, even Lily's illness and recovery, had all been part of a larger pattern that the forest itself had orchestrated. The forest chooses its guardians carefully, Thomas had written in his final entry. It prepares them through trials and challenges that test their character, their dedication, and their capacity for love. Ethan and Jessica passed every test, proved themselves worthy of the trust and responsibility they would inherit. Their daughter, Lily, will grow up as part of the guardian tradition, and when her time comes, she will choose whether to continue the work or pass it on to someone else the forest deems worthy. The revelation that their entire experience had been part of a larger plan orchestrated by forces beyond their understanding was initially overwhelming for both Ethan and Jessica. But as they processed the information over the following days and weeks, they began to feel a deep sense of peace and rightness about their situation. They hadn't simply stumbled into their role as guardians. They had been carefully selected and prepared for it through experiences that had tested and strengthened their character. Luna seemed to understand that they had discovered the truth about their calling, and her behavior toward them changed in subtle but significant ways. She became more deferential, more obviously respectful, as if she now recognized them not as students learning from Thomas's legacy, but as the rightful inheritors of a tradition that was far older and more significant than they had initially realized. Her own family history was intertwined with the guardian tradition, and she had been preparing for this transition her entire life. The winter months that followed were a time of deep learning and preparation. Ethan and Jessica studied the historical journals, learning about the methods and approaches that had been successful for previous guardians. They practiced the subtle arts of observation and intervention, developing their ability to identify families in need and provide help without revealing their involvement. Most importantly, they began to develop their own relationship with the forest consciousness that guided and directed their work. This relationship was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. It wasn't a matter of hearing voices or receiving direct communications, but rather a growing sensitivity to the subtle currents of need and possibility that flowed through their community. They learned to trust their intuitions, to follow hunches that led them to families facing crisis, to understand when and how to intervene in ways that would be most helpful and meaningful. Their first winter as full guardians brought them into contact with 7 different families, each facing their own unique challenges and each requiring a different approach to assistance. There was the elderly couple whose medical bills were threatening to force them from their home, the young veteran struggling with PTSD and unemployment, the immigrant family whose language barriers were preventing them from accessing needed services, and others whose stories of struggle and resilience reminded Ethan and Jessica of their own journey. Each successful intervention strengthened their confidence and deepened their understanding of the guardian role. They learned to work with local social services, medical providers, and community organizations, always maintaining their anonymity but ensuring that families received not just immediate financial help, but also connections to ongoing support systems. They discovered that their work was most effective when it addressed not just immediate crises, but also underlying systemic issues that contributed to family struggles. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Word of their mysterious interventions was beginning to spread throughout the community, creating a sense of hope and wonder that reminded longtime residents of similar stories from previous generations. Children drew pictures of guardian angels and forest spirits. Adults shared stories of unexpected help and miraculous recoveries, and the entire community seemed to be touched by a renewed faith in the possibility of goodness and connection. But with increased attention came the need for greater discretion and more sophisticated methods of intervention. Ethan and Jessica worked with Luna to develop new approaches that would allow them to continue their work while avoiding detection by curious reporters or well-meaning community members who might inadvertently compromise their anonymity. They established more complex networks of intermediaries and supporters, created multiple channels for delivering assistance, and developed contingency plans for situations where their involvement might be discovered. The most profound change, however, was in their own family dynamics. Lily, now approaching her 2nd birthday, seemed to have an intuitive understanding of her parents' work that went far beyond what should have been possible for a child her age. She showed unusual sensitivity to the emotions of others, often becoming fussy or restless when families in the community were facing crises, and calming down immediately after her parents had provided assistance. It was as if she were already connected to the forest consciousness that guided their work, already preparing for her own eventual role in the guardian tradition. As summer approached and they marked their first full year as guardians, Ethan and Jessica reflected on the extraordinary transformation their lives had undergone. They had evolved from desperate parents facing an impossible situation to become the source of hope and help for dozens of other families. Their own crisis had been the catalyst for a calling that gave their lives meaning and purpose beyond anything they had previously imagined. The work was demanding and sometimes emotionally difficult, but it was also deeply fulfilling in ways that conventional success could never match. They went to bed each night knowing that their efforts had made a real difference in the lives of real people, that their presence in the world was making it a better place for families facing their own impossible situations. The mystery and wonder that had sustained them during their own crisis had become the gifts they offered to others, creating a cycle of hope and healing that rippled outward through their community in ways they were only beginning to understand. Luna continued to be their most trusted partner and advisor, her wisdom and experience invaluable as they navigated the complexities of their guardian role. But she was also showing signs of age, and Ethan knew that eventually they would need to establish a relationship with her offspring, ensuring that the partnership between guardians and bears would continue into the next generation. The forest provided for all its creatures, but it also demanded that they plan for the future and prepare for the inevitable transitions that were part of the natural cycle of life and death. As they looked toward the future, Ethan and Jessica felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. Their own crisis had been transformed into a calling, Their desperation had become a source of strength for others, and their family had become part of something larger and more meaningful than they had ever dreamed possible. They were no longer just parents trying to provide for their child. They were guardians of hope, protectors of the vulnerable, living proof that love and compassion could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. The forest around their home continued to change with the seasons, but it also remained constant in its deeper rhythms and purposes. New families would face crises, new challenges would arise, new opportunities for help, and healing would present themselves. And Ethan, Jessica, and Lily would be there, watching and waiting, ready to provide the mysterious assistance that could transform desperation into hope, crisis into opportunity, and impossible situations into stories of miraculous recovery and renewed faith in the fundamental goodness of the world. Their story had come full circle, from recipients of mysterious help to providers of that same gift to others. But it was also just beginning, as they settled into their role as the latest guardians of a tradition that stretched back generations and would continue long after they were gone. The forest had chosen them, prepared them, and entrusted them with one of its most sacred responsibilities. And they would honor that trust with the same love, dedication, and wonder that had sustained them through their own darkest hours and brought them to this place of purpose and meaning. In the quiet moments between interventions, when the forest was peaceful and their work was temporarily done, Ethan would sometimes think back to that first morning when he had discovered money on his porch and wondered if he was losing his mind. Now he understood that he had been finding it instead, discovering a deeper truth about connection and purpose that most people never had the opportunity to experience. Their family had been chosen for something extraordinary, and they would spend the rest of their lives living up to that calling, providing hope and help to others while raising their daughter to understand that she was part of something larger and more wonderful than most people could imagine. The bear who had started it all, Luna, continued to watch over them with the same patient devotion she had shown from the beginning. But now her gaze held something new, a recognition that her long vigil had achieved its purpose, that the guardian tradition was secure in capable hands, and that the forest's work of protecting and nurturing its human inhabitants would continue for generations to come. She had been faithful to her calling, and now she could rest in the knowledge that others would carry on the work that had defined her life and given it meaning.